Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I am here today filming on Malta through the generous invitation of the Association of Maltese Arms Collectors and Shooters, AMACS. They have put together a selection of some really cool guns from Maltese private collections that we're going to be taking a look at. And today we have a Gerat Gerat 06H, or as this could, I think, actually legitimately be called, a Sturmgewehr 45M. This is a gun that was intended to be the replacement for the MP44 or StG-44. The StG was a tremendously successful gun, but it was developed very quickly, and it was kind of in a continuous process of very slight modifications, and if there was one major problem with it, it was that it just wasn't cheap enough. The German military was able to put them into definitive mass production and get a lot of them out on the battlefield, but not as many as they wanted. And so the Mauser company was working on a simplified, less expensive version of basically the same fundamental gun. And this is what they ended up developing. Now, this story actually starts in late 1943 when Mauser, and by the way, Mauser at this point has really quite a large R&D department. Something like 500 people in Mauser's R&D department, which is part of why they were able to come up with, when we look at German small arms, Mauser's a big part of it, they had all sorts of like crazy, cool, weird guns going on, more than most other countries. Well, that's largely because they had a huge R&D department working on this sort of thing. Anyway, to get back to our story, in late 1943, Mauser was experimenting with converting the G43 or K43 to a roller-locked system. So getting rid of the flapper locking and simplifying it to a roller lock system. And in theory, this was going to be the Gewehr 44M. They never ended up adopting that because really, by the time that they were ready to adopt something new, I think the emphasis was much more heavily on the 8x33 short cartridge. So that never happened. However, what they discovered in the process was bolt bounce could occasionally lead to full auto fire, or I think they had a full auto converted gun as part of their testing. And what they found is with the roller locked system, it would occasionally fire through bolt bounce when the rollers weren't fully locked. And it didn't completely fail. And so the engineers looking at it, in particular, a guy named Dr. Karl Meyer, started thinking about this and realizing that if you could get rid of, you could simplify the roller locked system if you could make it a half locked system, sort of a delayed blowback. In fact, exactly a delayed blowback. That would allow you to get rid of the gas piston entirely and simplify the bolt system. So he started experimenting with this, in particular with the 8x33 short cartridge. And this became the Gerat 06. There was, Gerat is the German word for like item, or it was used effectively as prototype or experimental model. And there was a whole series of them, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Number 6 was basically the simplified Sturmgewehr with a roller delayed blowback system. And that actually worked remarkably well. And by April of 1944, in the German documentation, they reported that they were experimenting with this idea. And then by late 1944, it had actually gotten substantial traction in, I believe it's February, sometime between like December 44 and February 45. The Mauser plant actually puts one of these guns through a 5,000 round endurance test, and it works. It's light, it's very simple. It's really a remarkably impressive mechanical system. And they communicate this back to the military, and the military is suitably interested, and in February of 45, they order production of 30, an initial run of 30 guns for user trials. Of course, at this point, they're kind of getting into the desperate last days of the war. Had they gotten these 30 guns, they probably would have gone to some, frontline company who would have shot the bejesus out of them and reported back on any problems that they had. However, the guns never quite got to that level because, of course, the war ended in May. And by April, by the middle of April, the Mauser plant was in serious danger of being overrun. And so in a last-ditch effort to maintain production, Hitler ordered basically the whole contents of the Mauser plant, all the tooling, all the prototypes, all the drawings, data, everything, loaded into a big train and shipped into the Austrian Alps, where they were hoping they could set up production like a hidden cave in the mountains. Really really last-ditch sort of stuff. And this plan was put into action, and the train actually departed on the night of April 19th and 20th, 1945. So the exact same time that Hitler is committing suicide in his bunker in Berlin, this train leaves Oberndorf for Austria. US troops liberate the Mauser factory, overrun and capture the Mauser factory, and when the intelligence guys coming behind them started searching through the factory, they realized that there wasn't, like, none of the juicy, interesting stuff was there. So they put out a wider search, and on the 1st of June, 1945, they discover this train up in Austria. And it's actually discovered by a joint group of US and British military intelligence. And then they start going through this train. They find the engineers from Mauser who are accompanying it. And that's when they find all the really interesting stuff, including the sets of parts for these guns. So 30 were ordered. No guns were actually completed. Well, there were some prototypes completed, like the one that did the firing trial. But of that 30 gun production series, all they ever managed to make were basically part sets. So the receivers, the barrels, in fact, almost all of the parts, they didn't have stocks, and they didn't have fire control parts. Those just hadn't been manufactured by the time everything had to be packed up and shipped out. So they got some Mauser engineers who were being held as POWs in the area, and a bunch of these were actually completed by former Mauser employees for several of the Allied powers, the US and Britain and France, and probably, I don't think Russia, because the Russians weren't really involved in that area. But a number of the guns were actually put together. And so you will find these in a few major arms collections around the world held by national governments. So the Springfield Armory Museum collection has one of these. And that tends to make people think that the Germans actually built them. Well, sort of. I guess they were German parts built by German Mauser engineers, but they were done after the war. And some of the parts, like the fire control pieces and the stocks, all had to be manufactured new. Now, let's take a closer look at this one. And then when we're all done with that, I'll tell you the specific story of this particular gun. Obviously, you can see that this fits the basic profile of a Sturmgewehr. The Germans didn't want to change any of that. However, they did want to simplify things. So actually, before we start, I want to cover a couple quick things. First off, we have this little short magazine. And this is what you will generally see in pictures of these guns. You'll also see these, I think, occasionally in some Volkssturm pictures, but the intent was that the Sturmgewehr 45 was going to use the standard MP44 or MP43 StG-44 magazine, completely interchangeable. You see these magazines because these were designed for use on test racks. When you've got this thing bolted into a fixture for test firing in the factory, a long magazine like this just doesn't really fit in the fixtures. A very basic mechanical issue there. So instead, they cut down some magazines to like 10 rounds. That was perfectly sufficient for their test firing. And as a result, when the guns were captured, or in case of things like this that were all parts, when they pulled out the parts sets, these are the magazines that were around because this is what the factory had been using. So people think that they were going to be issued sometimes with short magazines. They were not. So that's the last we'll see of this little guy. Speaking of those magazines, in fact, let's take a closer look at this one that's in this particular rifle. This is an MP45 magazine, which is pretty rare, as you might expect. And you might think that that's the perfect magazine, or the appropriate magazine, to go with the StG-45 rifle. Well, actually, not quite. If we flip this over, you can see the three-letter manufacturer code there, GQM. This was a Czech factory that had been making StG magazines since basically the beginning of production. And they went through the whole range of production, starting when they had been marked MP43. And then around 1944, they were told to switch to MP44 markings for the magazines because the designation of the Sturmgewehr had changed. And then when 1945 rolled around, the factory just assumed that they were supposed to change to the next year at the same time. So they started making MP45 magazines. As it turned out, they were not supposed to. The previous change had been because the rifle designation changed. So they, I assume, got an angry letter from someone in the German Army ordnance system. And then they went back to either MP44 or StG-44, whichever was appropriate at that point. But not before they had produced a reasonably substantial number of MP45 magazines, which are a cool collector's item today. However, they're not quite what people think they are. So the magazine doesn't actually have a specific relation to the very late war pattern guns, but it's a pretty cool story. Now then, as for the rifle itself, we have a selector lever here on the side. So they have gotten away from the Sturmgewehr's system of having a push button for one function and a lever for another function. Instead, we have one lever that is safe, semi, and full auto. And it actually kind of falls under your thumb. You can access this from a firing grip. It's a pretty cool design. We have the magazine release button here, and if you're shooting it right-handed, this is designed to be, you grab the magazine like this, push the button, and pull the magazine out. So not intended to be done with the firing grip. These are not drop-free magazines, and they were never intended to be. We have a dust cover up here on the top, which is pretty cool because, of course, since there is a bolt handle, you have a big open slot in the side of the gun which will let dirt in. So instead, we put on this dust cover, which is a little tight here. There we go. We can rotate that dust cover closed. It seals up the gap very nicely. And then it has this reinforced section right here so that when you fire, the bolt handle is going to come back, hit this sloped cover, and actually rotate the dust cover open. Because this one is a little bit stiff, I'm going to do it manually, but you can see how that would function. The receiver and grip assembly are all one continuous piece. They're stamped in a left and a right half and then welded together. You can see the overlap here with a spot weld, more of those spot welds right up in there, and the front of the grip assembly. There are no separate grip panels. These are grooves that are actually stamped into that shell component. By the way, these little perforations are limiters. So unlike, say, the MP44, which had a very complicated integral fire control group built into this pivoting grip assembly, the StG-45, the Gerat 06H here, has a drop-in box, very much like what you will find in a modern HK, or rather an early HK firearm. And these little projections are stamped in there so that you push the trigger box down until it hits there. You push the selector lever through to lock it in place, and that's what keeps everything in the proper configuration. The rear end of the gun is very much like an MP44. The recoil spring goes down into the stock, and we just have a simple push pin going through the side to lock it in place. This pin, there's something a little wonky about the locking spring, so it doesn't want to go all the way in. So I'm just leaving it like that. At the front end, we have a Bakelite Handguard. Those of you who have shot an MP44 or read about German soldiers who did will know that the handguards on the MP44 got very hot rather quickly because they had no insulation of any kind. So the MP45 was going to have a nice Bakelite insulating handguard there. There is nothing under this. So the reason it's this diameter is because the receiver stamping continues all the way forward up to here at this same diameter. So then these two pins hold the Bakelite handguard in place, and we're not going to take that off. The rear sight is on a nice elevated tower, so you have a good sight picture while still having the axis of the bore right directly into your shoulder to prevent climb. Sight is graduated out to 800 meters, and this is a very typical, very standard German style of sight. Front sight is a little bit different in that it is a straight post. However, I can't guarantee you that the front sight was actually one of the original German parts. It would probably more likely have been a barleycorn front sight under that hood. And being a very late war gun, they dispensed with the need for muzzle threading. They weren't worried about trying to make these compatible with grenade launchers or silencers or anything elaborate like that. So just a plain, simple muzzle pinned on front sight block. Quick, easy, and inexpensive. Originally, these guns had no markings on them at all because, well, of course, they weren't actually completed guns. This one, however, is marked V20 and has a Mauser banner logo on it. We'll touch on why that is a little bit later. Now, for anyone who has disassembled an HK, you will immediately recognize how this works. Pretty simple. We're going to pull the rear pin right there, and then we can remove the buttstock. The spring, well, the spring's more STG-like. The spring goes down into the stock. You'll notice the flathead screws there. That is clearly not wartime German production. This whole assembly would have been manufactured after the war. It appears some of the parts kits had end caps with them, some did not. Now we can take out what is actually the extension tail for the recoil spring. This is a bit unusual. We'll take a closer look at that in a moment. We can then pull the bolt handle back, and we're going to have to take the dust cover off in order to get the bolt out. And just slide this back, and that comes off. That's just a nice sheet metal stamped part. Then we can pull the bolt back to here. The bolt handle comes out, and then the bolt and bolt carrier come out the back. And that is complete disassembly of the Gerat 06H, aka StG-45. By the way, H is for this long German word that I can't pronounce, but I'll print at the bottom of the screen, that means like half rigid locked. So where the roller locking was a solid locked action, this is a delayed blowback, and they indicated that with the H suffix on the design. Anyway, you can see just how simple this is. It's very much like an HK. Because it is a delayed blowback system, there's no gas piston, there's no moving barrel, there's no gas port, there's nothing under this except a receiver shell and a barrel and a trunnion, which in fact looks very much like an HK trunnion. So this is the original trunnion from this gun. Unfortunately, well, we'll take a look at this in just a moment. Now, of course, if you're not already aware, this is the gun that became the HK G3. So many of the engineers involved in this, guys like Vorgrimler and Alex Seidel and Meyer, would go on to be involved with HK. They would go first to France, where they worked on some roller delayed prototypes for the French. They then moved on to Spain, where they created the Set-Me rifle for the Spanish military, which really took this and turned it from a prototype concept idea into a finalized and militarily accepted mass-produced firearm. And that's a cool story on its own, but of course that's a story for another video. After Set-Me, these guys were finally able to return to Germany and do arms development work in Germany, which had not been allowable immediately after the war. So Seidel in particular would go on to be one of the founders of Heckler Koch, where they created this. Well, they turned this into the G3, and it became a remarkably popular rifle worldwide using this system. So that's the historical relevancy of the Gerat 06H, the StG-45. I want to point out at the back of the rifle here, you can see that this is not a tubular receiver. Like you have guns like the Suomi, where there's a tubular receiver and then a square grip assembly secondary bit that's attached to it. This was made with two pressings, and you can actually see where they overlap here, and you can see where they overlap right back up here. So a left side and a right side pressing that are then welded together. There are fake reproductions of these out there, and some of them you will find actually have a tubular receiver with a second square piece attached down here. Those are easily recognizable by having this round section, having actual metal right here. So something to be aware of if you are in the market for one of these. Not that there are a whole lot of them floating around. One other change that was made between the initial prototypes and this production of part sets was location of the charging handle. On the part sets, the charging handle is horizontal in the side. There are a few pictures of some of the early prototype guns or their parts. And on those, the receiver wall comes up substantially higher, and those had a charging handle that came out at an angle upwards. Not so much horizontal, but tilted up like so. You can see the fire control group down here. I'm not going to go so much into detail on this because I can't really take this out, unfortunately, but it is hammer fired. We have, I believe, a disconnector up there. There are some, if you get the book Full Circle, by Blake Stevens, that goes into, has some very good exploded views of all the component parts in here. The bolt carrier and bolt head are obviously extremely similar to HK designs. This, if you look at this closely, you can see it has kind of a rough finish under the paint, or a rough metallic surface under the finish. This was obviously a forged part, and then it was machined where necessary to have the proper tolerances, clearances for riding on the rails that are stamped into the receiver. And that's what these two are on each side. Those are rails that the bolt rides in here. What this does not have that HK does is an anti-bounce lever. So the HK will have a very strong spring here that locks this thing in place and prevents it from bouncing when it closes. This can bounce when it closes, and that could potentially be a problem, but of course remember, these were 30 prototype parts kits, so not everything had been done on them developmentally. We can take this apart easily because it doesn't have that lever, and then the front half of the firing pin actually comes out. There's the back half right back there that gets hit by the hammer. It's not a spring-loaded firing pin. I don't want to spend a tremendous amount of time on the mechanical system here because you can find that very well explained in videos about HKs, including some earlier stuff I've done. But the basic idea of the roller locking system, or roller delayed system, is that when this bolt is all the way back, these rollers are pushed outward. They're pushed into two matching recesses in the trunnion, and that prevents the bolt from moving backward when it fires. However, those, if you push in on these, you can actually push the bolt carrier backwards. And that's what makes this a delayed blowback and not a locked breech system. So when the gun is in battery, those rollers are resting on this angled section right here, which means when you fire it, the forces pushing backward on the bolt are split by this angled section, and some go outward and some push backward. And the reduction in force going straight backward is what delays the opening of the bolt. So during the development process for this, they did a lot of experimentation with the weight of the bolt carrier back here and also the exact angle of this surface up at the front in order to get it to work just right. So this, on more modern HKs, you'll see that this angle, this system varies for different calibers, like the HK93 in 5.56 versus the HK91 in 7.62. Now we can talk about this trunnion at this point. This is the original trunnion that was made in Mauser in 45. And after Mauser assembled this particular gun, which we'll talk about in a moment, they test fired it and it went kablooey and sheared off both of the locking recesses here. So that is obviously not so good. So the gun was built with a replacement trunnion. I presume this is probably a heat treating issue that led to this. And the replacement was heat treated correctly and survives, was proof tested and survived. But it's kind of cool. Normally when you see one of these rifles, this piece is very solidly welded inside. You can actually see where they have welded it around the back here. And then there are two dimples on the side where steel was pressed in and a pin. The pin also held in place the barrel right there. So these dimples are rather like a Sturmgewehr. The welds are rather like an HK. It is, of course, a perfect hybrid between the two. One other interesting feature, to me at least, is this additional tail that holds the recoil spring. So once this became more common as the HK system, this tail was basically built into the bolt carrier. You have a stem on the back to hold the recoil spring. But when Mauser was doing these in 1945, they had this as a separate part. So the recoil spring is here, this pushes on this, and they act separately. You'll notice there's a cutout in the bottom right here that gives space for the hammer to swing up inside and hit the firing pin in the middle. Again, some of the part sets had these when they were captured, some did not. So some of these have been manufactured at other times and places. I should also mention that none of these parts had a finish on them, a bluing or any other sort of finish, parkerizing. When they were captured in the train, they were all in the white. So any finish that you'll ever find applied has been done after the war by whoever assembled the guns. So this particular gun has a really cool backstory to it. These were all assembled, like I said, well, like I corrected myself earlier, in the Netherlands. And even while the assembly of some of these was going on, a few of the parts kits did manage to work their way into private hands, even back then. So, you know, officers involved in the program may have traded one off to someone here, one off to someone there. And eventually, I don't know if it was right then or if it was later, one of the sets of parts came into the possession of a guy named Henk Visser, who is a really quite notable, famous firearms collector in the Netherlands, unfortunately passed away several years ago. And he was not just an arms collector, but also heavily involved in the arms industry. So in the 1960s, Visser had an ownership stake in Mauser as well as H&K, and had one of these part sets, and through apparently about 15 years of slow work and bribes and other, you know, whatever else it took at the time, he managed to get from the British some of the original drawings that had been salvaged, and he had his part set, and then he had Mauser actually complete and assemble this set of parts into this rifle, because, well, when you have an ownership stake in the company, you can get them to do things like that for you. It's kind of cool. Now, Visser at the time was under the impression that 19 guns had been assembled in the Netherlands right after the war, and so he decided to serialize this one as number 20 to be the next in that batch. In retrospect, however, today, we don't think that 19 number is accurate, but no one really knows for sure. So that's how this one ended up with the serial number of V20, V for trials in German, and that's why it has a Mauser logo on it. It was actually built by Mauser. And then, of course, the original trunnion that was in the gun failed. Mauser, of course, when they assembled this gun, they're a legitimate factory. They proof tested it, and kablooey. So there is a new manufactured trunnion in the gun that Mauser made after the original one failed. So other than that trunnion and the stock and the fire control parts, which were made to original blueprint, the rest of these parts are original German production or wartime Mauser production StG-45M parts, making this one of very few. In fact, given that it was made with the original blueprints and most of the others were not, those blueprints hadn't been necessarily located or were used when the guns were being initially assembled in the Netherlands, this is probably the most accurate reproduction or completion of an StG-45 that's out there. So there were never more than 30 to begin with, all as parts, and only a few of those got assembled, and this is probably the best one of the bunch. So very, very cool. I really appreciate the collector who let me take a closer look at this and show it to you guys. If you enjoy seeing this sort of thing online, please do consider supporting me directly through the website membership program or through Patreon. It's funding from viewers like you that makes it possible for me to travel to places like Malta here and take a look at really cool guns like this. And of course, if you're looking for a new place to live in the European Union with particularly good gun laws, well, maybe you should consider Malta. Thanks for watching.